added the GERS plan, the police and fire plan, and the MERS plan all together. And if you take a look at that, you're just about 60% funded across all those plans with a little variation within each of those. And you can see relative to some of the other downriver communities, you'd be toward the top end of the chart there. Wyandott's a little bit more funded on their pension than you are. But relative to Romulus, Lincoln Park, you'd be well ahead of their funding levels as it stands as of June 30th. And Trenton, pretty close to them in terms of funding. And so relative to some of your peer communities, or at least close by neighbors, your funding levels are relatively consistent and toward the higher end. When we look at our broader governmental group, what we're finding is that the funding levels, they run somewhere between 65 and 85%. So maybe you're just a little shy of that under the 65 for the pensions in general. But some are heavily funded and some are less funded. But on average, we're seeing a little higher percentage in total for pension. But your pension funding percentages have remained relatively stable over the last 3 years, and so you continue to fund the plans as required by the state. So you have to make annual required contributions by state law, and you're making those timely. The last slide I wanted to spend a little bit of time is, we called it economic outlook, but really, the question was, okay, we're still in the pandemic here, vaccines are coming out, what does this mean, and what are some of the things we need to be looking at or concerned about, or at least wary of? And so tried to capture a few of those items on the list here. First, and they're not in any specific order, but just the cost of health care. So one of the things that would be a concern that would be out there is that there's been a lot of delayed procedures, a lot of delayed surgeries, and those get pushed into 2021. And so eventually your premium cost catches up to those, as those instances occur. So maybe near term the cost of health care has been down because not as many people have actually been seeking health care, but over the next year and a half, 18 months or so, you may see an uptick in terms of those types of surgeries and procedures that may impact the insurance premiums going forward. So keeping an eye on that. That's always an area that's tough to contain, but making sure that we're looking at that both this coming year and in future budget years ahead of time, and getting some sense for that would be important. The next two items really fall under kind of the state funding side of things, and one would be for roads and one would be for state shared revenue. And so the road funding is primarily coming from gas taxes, and the state shared revenue is primarily coming from sales tax. So relative to the road funding, it's interesting because we've looked at, and there were just some updates that came out, but we've looked at the road funding and looked at where the city's budgeted, and right now your budgets look a little bit conservative, which I think is a good spot to be in. The road funding has remained stronger than I would have anticipated it would, just based on the traffic that's on the road and less gas being used. But it hasn't fallen significantly at this stage, and is projected out at least not to go down significantly. It's going to go down a bit, but not significantly as it stands right now based on the latest state estimates. So that's one always to keep an eye on, because certainly that you use that for your road costs, your construction progress, road maintenance, and I know you've got some future projects that you're planning as well. So having a sense for that and planning that out conservatively, I think, would be important. On the state shared revenue side of things, this would be one too that I was a little bit concerned about from a sales tax side, but the consumer spending in 2020 in the state is actually quite high, and it's led to, in particular, online. So that's led to a lot of sales and use tax paid online. The percentages, I think I just looked that up, it's up $300 million in terms of sales and use tax paid for online purchases this year. So maybe the retail establishments are not experiencing that gain, but the online purchases are helping the state coffers. And so the latest projections from the state aren't as bad as I also thought they might be, and they're down just a bit. But pretty consistent with where they were prior year. So that's a big funding source for your general fund. It's over $8 million in your general fund. So you want to continue to watch that, but it's not quite as bad as I would have thought. So so far so good there. Property tax values is one other area. So Bill showed you that graph of how long it's going to take to kind of catch up to kind of pre-recession levels. That's an area that I always take a look at to see what is this going to mean going forward. And right now, with many of our communities, and Taylor appeals should be the same thing, the property tax levels or values have stayed pretty stable and gone up a little bit incrementally, but not bad. So that's an area that continue to watch as we go forward here. A lot of that, I think, gets driven by a couple things. One is the unemployment rates, and two, the level of income that people are earning, because if they're not able to afford to stay in their homes, the home values are going to drop over time. But we haven't seen that significantly happen yet, but it's something to certainly watch and be cautious of from a budgeting standpoint. And then lastly, Bill covered on the one graph the court revenues and service charges. So that's one that was down last year, in particular fourth quarter. That's continued on to this budget year as well. And so that's one that you're just going to have to continue to budget very conservatively until the traffic picks up and people start to get back to work, and there's a lot more traffic on the roads. The last thing on there, so there is a website there, and I put a link in there as well, because it has some pretty good information around unemployment rates, personal income projections, some fast recovery industries, which is really just about everybody besides leisure, hospitality, and in-person retail. And then some strategies for winter downtown areas or pseudo downtown areas as well, in terms of how to bring some additional revenues in for communities. So I thought that might be a good resource just to take a look at and get some updated data to help you as you go through this year's budget process and consider how that might impact some of the items at the top of the slide there. So let me stop there. We've got a couple letters that we can walk through quickly. Any questions on the data in the slides? Okay. So let me walk through the letters real quick. So there's two letters there. There's one, a really skinny one, and that's the internal control letter. And that's really just a separate letter to those charged with governance, in this case the city council and the mayor. And it really explains that we did take a look at the internal controls at the city, and in particular as they relate to financial reporting, and we did not find any issues with the internal controls that warranted being included in this letter. You may recall in some previous years we've had what are referred to as significant deficiencies in internal control, and we've talked about those. We did not have that this year or last year, so those matters that we have found in previous years have been addressed and continue to be addressed, and we did not have any additional items this year in terms of internal control issues, even despite working during the pandemic. So that, please.
Is that included in our package?
I don't have that either.
Okay.
They were not included in the package. I have them here.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Gotcha. Okay. All right.
So if you want to go over them, I'll
Sure. Okay, that'd be great. Yeah. Yeah. Why don't you go through? Why don't you pass up the thick one first, if you would? Sorry about that. I didn't know that. While they're passing those out, the thicker letter, which I wanted to spend just a bit of time on, so this is what I mentioned was the back-end communication to the letter that we sent out, communication we sent out at the front end of the audit. So now that the audit's complete, we talk about, okay, we said what we were going to do on the front-end letter, here's what we did and here's what we found. And some of these are required communications. The accounting standards require that those happen to those charged with governance, in this case the city council. And so it walks through, a couple different things related to the audit. But maybe the main things to talk about are that you do have some sensitive estimates in your financial statements. And I'll let you catch up when they pass those out. So I'm at the top of page 3 in that thicker letter.
It's at page 3, correct?
Yes, at the top, yes. Thank you. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Jason. Okay. And so we're required to communicate what we would view as some of the most sensitive estimates that are in the financial statements. And so there's really 3 that we typically talk about here at Taylor, and this would be pretty consistent with what we see with other communities as well. So first of all, you're self-insured for workers' comp. And so there's a number of assumptions that go through in determining what's your end of the year workers' comp liability. And that would include caseload in terms of number of cases in the current year. We look at historical data as well, and then come up with an estimate based on what's referred to incurred but not reported cases. So things that may be out there that aren't yet reported, but that would be a liability because they've been incurred.